You've probably heard of Apollo, the shiny god of the sun, music, healing, and prophecy. But before he got his golden reputation, he did something odd. Something romantic, impulsive, and botanically irreversible. He fell in love with a tree. Or more specifically, with a nymph who turned into a tree to avoid his advances. Let's start from the beginning, with a bow and a bad attitude. Apollo wasn't just a sun god. He was also an archer, a proud one. And like most proud archers, he didn't take kindly to being mocked. Unfortunately for him, Eros, the god of love, was an even smaller god with an even bigger chip on his shoulder. Apollo had recently teased Eros about his tiny bow, suggesting that it was more a toy than weapon. Eros, who was not known for healthy conflict resolution, responded in kind. He pulled out 2 arrows, one gold-tipped, which ignites love, and one lead-tipped, which repels it. He shot Apollo with the gold arrow, and then he shot a nymph named Daphne with the lead one. Now, Daphne wasn't just any nymph. She was a follower of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, sworn to remain a virgin and spend her days frolicking in forests, away from the drama of gods and men. She was, in modern terms, not looking to be anyone's girlfriend. Especially not the obsessive type. But love is blind, and divine love is blind, deaf, persistent, and often accompanied by a blinding golden aura. Apollo, now burning with passion, began chasing Daphne across the hills and valleys of ancient Greece. He called out poetry. He ran barefoot. He told her she was his one and only. She replied by sprinting faster, and so it went Apollo, a god of great stature and eloquence, chasing after a woman who absolutely did not want to be chased. Now, you might wonder, where were the other gods? Surely someone saw this and thought, maybe we should intervene? But as with most myths, the Olympians were busy, distracted, or more likely, just enjoying the show. Daphne ran to the edge of exhaustion. Her feet, blistered from stones and roots, led her to the river god Peneus, who also happened to be her father. In desperation, she begged him for help. Not to be hidden, not to be rescued, but to be transformed so that she would never again be seen as desirable. And he obliged. Before Apollo could reach her, her feet rooted into the soil. Her skin turned to bark. Her hair stretched into leaves. And there, in the stillness of the Greek countryside, stood the first laurel tree. Apollo reached out, heart pounding, only to grasp wooden branches. But love, or obsession, or divine embarrassment, doesn't just vanish. Apollo stood beside that tree and declared it sacred. He made it his symbol. He promised to wear her leaves as a crown. Victors would be crowned with laurel in her name. It was, perhaps, the most romantic restraining order in ancient mythology. But what's most interesting here isn't the chase. It's the awkward aftermath. What does a god do with his love when it becomes flora? And what did it mean for Apollo, a shining symbol of rationality and order, to be humbled by love itself? Daphne, now rooted in place, would never run again. But she would also never love, never speak, never move. She escaped her fate, but did she also lose her freedom? Or did she finally gain it? And as for Apollo, did he ever stop visiting that tree? Or was that the beginning of a god's long, quiet obsession with symbols over substance? After Daphne became a laurel tree, things didn't go quiet. In fact, the story only deepened. Apollo, stunned and rejected, not just emotionally, but metaphysically, was left in the forest beside the silent statue of his failed pursuit. And yet, instead of moving on as gods with endless lifespans and options often do, he chose to stay. For hours, perhaps days. He whispered to the bark. He stroked the leaves and vowed eternal devotion. And then he did what many do after a breakup. That leaves one both embarrassed and bewildered. He turned the pain into ritual. Apollo declared the laurel sacred. Not just any laurel tree, but this one, Her tree, her transformation became a symbol of purity, triumph, and the deep sadness of divine rejection. In later myths, it's said that he used his powers to ensure the laurel tree remained evergreen, a tree that never dies, never sheds, a lover frozen in time. Some say he even made a wreath of its leaves and wore it everywhere, as a crown, as a mark of loss worn like victory. In the years that followed, Apollo's laurel took on layers of meaning. Wreaths were awarded at the Pythian Games competitions, held in Apollo's honor every 4 years at Delphi. Much like the Olympic Games, which came later, these events included athletics, music, and poetry. Victors received not gold or coins, but a simple laurel crown. Imagine training for years, competing in the heat of the Greek sun, only to be rewarded with leaves from a tree born of a woman who ran away from a god. That was the prestige of the time sacrifice, beauty, and symbolism over material wealth. And there's more. At Delphi, Apollo's most sacred oracle sat above a crack in the earth, inhaling sweet vapors and speaking cryptic truths. She was known as the Pythia, and she too was crowned with a laurel wreath. Laurel leaves were chewed or burnt as incense in the temple, believed to induce visions and divine inspiration. In other words, the tree that once ran from Apollo became the key to understanding his mysteries. But what of Daphne? Did her identity vanish into bark and leaf? In some versions of the myth, it is said that her spirit lived on, trapped in the tree. Her voice no longer carried words, but rustled through branches. She remained sentient, rooted and silent, hearing every ode Apollo sang beneath her shade. There's something quietly horrifying about that. Eternal stillness while the one you fled continues to adore you in ritual. But in Greek myth, transformations are often final. Unlike modern fairy tales, there are no enchanted princes waiting to be freed. Trees stay trees. Statues remain marble. Fate is absolute, and the gods rarely apologize. Yet, mortals kept coming. They came to the forest with knives and reverence, cutting laurel branches for ceremonies and crowns. Every coronation, every poetic performance, every temple rite involved these leaves. The tree became a conduit for art, a symbol of the highest excellence. Not because it was powerful, but because it was distant, unreachable, pure. It's worth noting the irony. Apollo, god of order and prophecy, could see the future of others, but failed to foresee his own romantic humiliation. His crown became a symbol of vision, yet it was born from blindness. Even linguistically, the laurel stuck. The word laureate, as in poet laureate, comes directly from this myth. The highest artistic honor in many countries is named for the girl who chose branches over love. What makes this myth endure is not just the chase, but the transformation of loss into symbol. Why would a god celebrate his failure? Perhaps because it was the only way to make sense of it. In a pantheon of powerful beings known for turning people into animals, rivers, constellations, and even puddles of gold, Daphne's transformation stands apart, not for its violence, but for its silence. No punishment. No grand moral. Just escape. And escape, in ancient Greece, wasn't easy. Women in mythology were rarely given control over their bodies or destinies. Daphne's decision to become a tree may seem extreme, but it was one of the few examples of agency in a world where even gods could not be denied. Still, Apollo never forgot. He is always painted in statues and paintings wearing the laurel crown, looking noble. Yes, but also distant. Poets, emperors, and generals would mimic the look for centuries. Julius Caesar wore one. So did Napoleon. All imitating a lovesick god's tribute to a girl who turned to bark to avoid him. We don't often think of symbols as rooted in personal embarrassment, but here we are. So, what's the lesson? That obsession can be dignified. That trees remember. or that the greatest myths aren't about triumphs, but about losses we cannot undo. It's strange to think of this myth, with its dry landscape, wind-blown leaves, and wordless tree, as the root of so many cultural rituals. But that's how mythology works. Mundane things become sacred through repetition and time. A leaf becomes a crown. A chase becomes a cautionary tale. A tree becomes a shrine. But did Apollo ever feel regret? Or did he convince himself that turning Daphne into ritual was enough? And if the wind through the laurel whispered answers, did anyone bother to listen? Let's return once more to the forest's edge, the moment after Daphne's body became bark, her arms outstretched into branches, her golden hair curling into laurel leaves. The ground beneath her stilled. Apollo, standing before this newly born tree, did not rage or curse or demand she return. Instead, he mourned. Quietly, there is something particularly human, yes, even in a god, about the instinct to make meaning from loss, and Apollo, for all his divine power, could not bring her back. So he did what many of us do when faced with irreversible rejection. He rebranded it. The tree wasn't just Daphne anymore. It became the Laurus nobilis, the noble laurel. Apollo didn't weep for long. He made wreaths. He wrote songs. He built temples. And in a way, he won. Not Daphne herself, of course, but the narrative. In future retellings, his pursuit would be immortalized as tragic, romantic, noble. Her resistance would be reduced to backstory. Her transformation would be remembered not as a desperate act of freedom, but as the origin of a lovely botanical. Tradition it was, in some ways, the earliest recorded case of historical spin. And yet, the laurel's symbolism endured, partly because it was beautiful, but mostly because it was vague. It could mean so many things: purity, sacrifice, artistic excellence, military victory, prophecy, virtue. But no one talks about the silence at its core. That when you see a laurel wreath today, it's not just a mark of greatness. It's a memorial. In the centuries that followed, the laurel tree spread across cultures. Roman generals were crowned with laurel after successful campaigns. The practice migrated into early Christian traditions, then into academic ones. Students who completed their studies in medieval Italy were called baccalaureus, the origin of the modern term bachelor, which shares a linguistic root with laurel. Even now, you might rest on your laurels or win laurels for achievement. The phrase is so commonplace, we forget what it means. You've been honored with the leaves of a girl who ran from glory. The myth also echoes through art. Bernini sculpted Apollo and Daphne in the 17th century, freezing the chase into marble. In the moment he captured, Apollo's hand just barely touches Daphne's waist as bark climbs her skin. Her expression is not one of peace, it's horror. Her mouth is open, not in surrender, but in plea. Bernini carved that desperation in stone, one of the few artists to show her terror, not just Apollo's passion. It's hard to look at that statue and call it a love story. And yet, the myth is still taught that way. Apollo is rarely questioned. His pursuit is seen as devotion. Daphne's choice is tragic. But perhaps the tragedy is that her choice needed to be made at all. In myth, trees often symbolize wisdom or rootedness. In this one, the symbolism is more uncomfortable. Daphne chose a permanent vegetative silence over a future shaped by someone else's desires. And the god she fled commemorated that silence with parades. Still, Daphne got something no other mythological woman quite achieved: permanence. Not in name. Perhaps her story is less famous than Helen's, less dramatic than Medea's, less celebrated than Athena's, but her form endured. You can still find laurel trees growing in the Mediterranean. Their scent drifts through kitchens. Their leaves garnish dishes. Their branches form crowns for scholars and poets. She is everywhere, and no one notices. And maybe that's exactly what she wanted done in the end. Apollo's wreath became his apology. But it was an apology that asked for no reply. There was no redemption arc, no final reunion, no rehumanizing of Daphne. She remained always just out of reach, frozen, fragrant, and unknowable. What does it say about our stories that the most persistent ones are born from unfulfilled longing? What does it say about divinity that even gods must sometimes settle for symbols? And what does it say about us that we still crown ourselves with leaves from a story we barely remember? Perhaps, in a way, every laurel wreath is a question in disguise. Not who is the victor, but who was lost. Daphne's myth is not the grandest in Greek mythology, nor the most violent. It lacks the spectacle of war or the weight of destiny, but that's exactly what makes it so lasting. It is a quiet story of refusal, of retreat, of becoming something still rather than something seen. It asks nothing of you, only that you remember. And when you next see a crown of laurel adorning the head of a winner, a scholar, or a statue, you might hear the faint rustle of leaves. Not applause, but a whisper. Hephaestus the lame god, Olympus' forgotten craftsman, you know the names. Zeus, Apollo, Athena, gods of thunder, sun, and war. They're the celebrities of Olympus, towering, shining, flawless, but nestled quietly in their shadow, often out of sight and certainly out of favor, is one god who never quite fit the mold. Hephaestus, tot lame, dirty, burned, brilliant. He wasn't born for glory. In fact, some say he wasn't even born from desire. One version of his origin claims Hera, queen of the gods, created him alone, out of spite. She was angry that Zeus had birthed Athena from his forehead without her, so she made her own child, a divine act of single parenthood. But it didn't turn out as planned. Hephaestus was born imperfect, his foot twisted, his body not symmetrical. He didn't glow with celestial beauty, and Olympus, like many courts obsessed with perfection, did not forgive such flaws. In the earliest myth, Hera took one look at her newborn son and hurled him from Olympus. Down he fell, not just from grace, but from heaven. He plummeted through the sky, landing finally on the island of Lemnos, broken and alone. You'd think that would be the end of his story. But Hephaestus did what many forgotten figures in history do. He adapted. He built far from Olympus, beneath volcanic caverns and smoky cliffs. Hephaestus began forging. With hands blistered and breath thick with soot, he turned rejection into mastery. While the other gods drank nectar and composed poems, Hephaestus hammered bronze and bent iron. His forge became his kingdom, the fire his companion. He learned to mold metal like clay. Machines, automatons, weapons, he made them all. He was not graceful, but he was useful, and that was enough to bring Olympus calling again. The myths diverge here. In one version, Hephaestus returns of his own accord, rising from the earth like an ancient engineer god, arriving unannounced with gifts too beautiful to refuse. In another, he tricks the gods into fetching him. When Hera becomes trapped in a golden throne of his own making, one that she cannot escape, Hephaestus agrees to release her only if he's welcomed back to Olympus with honor. He wasn't asking for love, just space. And tools. So he returned, not as a celebrated son, but as a supplier. Hephaestus became the official smith of the gods. Every throne, every weapon, every piece of celestial hardware came from his forge. He crafted Hermes' winged sandals. He made Achilles indestructible armor. He built Zeus Thunderbolts. His creations held up heaven. And yet, no songs were sung for him. There were no odes to soot or to sweat. No temples glowing in his name. Hephaestus, like many in history who worked behind the scenes, remained necessary, but invisible. Even his marriage was a political patchwork. To balance his status on Olympus, the gods arranged for him to marry Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, charm, and desire. A match made not in heaven, but in awkward divine bookkeeping. She, glowing and flirtatious. He, limping and work-stained. You can imagine how it went. Aphrodite found solace elsewhere, often with Ares, the god of war. And Hephaestus, knowing but unable to stop it, did what he always did. He built something. A net, not a metaphorical one, but a real, unbreakable golden mesh, so fine it was invisible. He caught the lovers mid-affair and dragged them before the other gods. But instead of justice, he got laughter. The myth paints a cruel picture. The cuckolded smith god mocked by the very beings who relied on his craft. Apollo may have shone about order, and Zeus may have ruled with power, but it was Hephaestus' hammer that made their glory possible. Still, he stayed. He kept building. His workshop expanded. His tools became legends, and his name, though rarely spoken in temples, was etched into every shield and sword. Hephaestus was not forgotten. He was absorbed into things. If you've ever looked at a beautifully wrought object and admired the unseen hands that made it, you've honored him. And if you've ever wondered why the creators of the world are often left behind while the users take the credit, well, so did Hephaestus. But here's the question. Did he ever really want Olympus? Or did the forge, with its glowing heart and loyal fire, offer him something the gods never could? When you picture Olympus, you likely see marble halls, golden thrones, and radiant gods basking in their own perfection. But somewhere beneath those polished heights, perhaps beneath the very floors of the great palaces, there was a different world. One of smoke, fire, and clanging iron. That was Hephaestus' realm. While the other Olympians busied themselves with war, wine, and gossip, Hephaestus labored in obscurity. The forge was both his punishment and his sanctuary. It is one of mythology's great ironies that the god most associated with physical imperfection created the most flawless objects the gods ever owned. He built palaces for the immortals, weapons that could never miss, armor that could turn the tide of battle, chairs that could sing, trip, or imprison, even automata mechanical golden women who worked silently by his side, cleaning his workshop and assisting with tasks. They were the first artificial intelligences of myth, and Hephaestus made them alone. Imagine that. A lonely god, spurned by his mother, unloved by his wife, building companions out of metal, not for glory, not for worship, but for efficiency, and maybe, just maybe, for company. There's a humility in Hephaestus' story. While the others made grand gestures, he made tools. And yet, he was indispensable. It's often said that Hephaestus built the very gates of Olympus. Without him, nothing would open. Nothing would close. Nothing would hold. This wasn't just symbolism. In ancient Greece, the smith was essential. In fact, the craft of metallurgy was so sacred it was considered a divine gift. The ability to control fire and transform earth into tools and weapons gave humanity an edge over nature. And who was the god of this divine transformation? Hephaestus. He was the original technologist, the god of process, of function. But like many engineers through history, he was praised only when things worked and ignored when they didn't. You can see echoes of Hephaestus in every ancient culture. In Mesopotamia, there was Ea, god of crafts and knowledge. In Egypt, Ptah, another, god of creation through thought and design. But Hephaestus was unique in that his deformity was part of the myth, not something glossed over or hidden. His limp wasn't just physical, it symbolized the cost of mastery. To create beauty, he had to be banished. To build for the gods, he had to be kept at a distance. Even in myth, perfection came at a price. And then there was the fall. Again. In A lesser-known story. Zeus hurls Hephaestus from Olympus for taking Hera's side in an argument. He lands on Lemnos a second time. The same island. The same injury. It raises a question. Was Hephaestus doomed to fall forever? Was that his cycle? Rejection, creation, return, repeat. But each fall changed him, hardened him. He became more focused, less trusting, and his inventions grew stranger, more functional, less decorative. He crafted arrows for Eros that could control love. He forged chains strong enough to bind Prometheus to a rock for eternity. He built the tools of punishment as well as glory. And all the while, he remained on the margins. Not feared like Hades, not loved like Apollo, not wise like Athena, just necessary. You see, Hephaestus represents a kind of divine bureaucracy, the quiet, mechanical heartbeat of Olympus. Without him, the gods would still be arguing in the clouds, naked and unarmed. But because of him, they had weapons, palaces, infrastructure. Power with form. His myth is not one of rise and fall. It is one of staying, of enduring, of outlasting those who glittered brighter but burned out sooner. Even his name carried weight. Hephaestus is thought to derive from a pre-Greek word related to fire or volcanoes. The connection is clear as forge was not symbolic. It was literal, volcanic, constant. And he lived in it. The island of Lemnos, his mythical home, is volcanic in origin. Ancient people believed he worked beneath the earth. His hammer blows mistaken for thunder. His fire for lightning. His breath for smoke rising from the vents of the earth. It's no wonder that blacksmiths in many cultures were seen as both mystical and dangerous. They controlled the boundary between nature and civilization, between ore and blade. Hephaestus stood on that edge, but he was never invited to the center. There's a quiet sadness to that. Hephaestus gave shape to power, but never received it. His creations helped win wars, crown kings, and tame monsters. But the credit was always passed upward. It makes you wonder. How many other stories in history were built by hands we never see? How many brilliant minds were cast aside because they didn't glitter? And what does it say about Olympus and about us, that the god of creation was the one most often forgotten? By the time most of the myths about Hephaestus had settled into the literary canon, his role was firmly established. He was the divine mechanic, not quite worshipped with fanfare, not quite ignored. Like a background character in a play he helped build, he was present in every scene, yet rarely at the center of any. His temple in Athens, the Hephaestion, still stands one of the best preserved ancient temples in the city. It's quiet, overshadowed by the Parthenon, but elegant, solid, built from stone, not stories. And perhaps that's fitting. Even in his architectural legacy, Hephaestus whispers rather than shouts. You might wonder, did Hephaestus ever get his due? In myth, rarely. But in culture, more than you'd expect. He became the patron of all artisans, blacksmiths, and craftsmen. Every time metal struck metal, every time fire melted ore, every time a thing was made, not spoken, or soon his presence was felt. In workshops across Greece and Rome, he was the unseen supervisor. He was also one of the few gods who could work with the physical world, not just influence it. While Zeus hurled thunderbolts and Poseidon stirred the sea, Hephaestus forged their tools. He made divine action possible, and yet his personal life remained tangled in discomfort. Aphrodite never stayed faithful. Ares, god of war, her lover, was everything Hephaestus was not: smooth, strong, and desired. Their affair wasn't just betrayal. It was contrast. Beauty choosing violence over craft. And Hephaestus, once again, was reduced to reaction. He made nets. He plotted traps. He caught the lovers. But in the end, no punishment held. The gods laughed, shrugged, and moved on. Olympus was not built for justice. It was built for spectacle. Still, Hephaestus worked. He made a chariot that rolled itself. He built jewelry that moved. He fashioned tripods that could walk, long before human engineers dreamt of robots. He made arrows that ignited desire and armor that deflected fate. And when the Trojan War broke out, perhaps the most soon conflict in Western literature, Hephaestus played a quiet, pivotal role. He forged Achilles' armor, a shield so detailed it contained entire worlds within its surface. Cities at peace, cities at war, constellations, rivers, festivals, justice, crime. All in metal. All made in a forge by a god who once fell from heaven. Because of how he looked, it's one of the most powerful images in mythology. Achilles' rage, his grief, his vengeance, all contained, quite literally, by the craftsmanship of Hephaestus. The most human of gods made the armor for the most godlike of men. And yet, you rarely see that armor in paintings. People paint the war, the rage, the hero. Not the hands that built the protection. That's the legacy of Hephaestus. One of shaping without credit, of enabling without applause. He represents a particular truth. Not all contributions are visible. Not all creators are celebrated. But everything you see, everything that works, everything that functions exists because someone, somewhere, spent time alone, in the heat, building. You can almost hear him, still, hammering in the background. A rhythm of creation beneath the noise of Olympus. Even in modern times, the figure of the lonely builder appears again and again. The tinkerer, the inventor, the machinist, always necessary. Often overlooked. In Hephaestus myth, you find no climactic redemption, no glorious apotheosis. He doesn't rise to lead Olympus. He doesn't become beloved. His arc doesn't bend toward justice. It bends toward permanence. Because the things he made outlast the gods themselves. The laurel of Apollo will fade. The loves of Aphrodite will pass. The rage of Ares will settle. But the tools? They remain. And, maybe, in the end, that is the quieter form of immortality. Not to be remembered, but to be built into the world. So next time you see an intricately made thing, be it an old key, a hand-wrought hinge, or a complex machine pause, not to worship, not even to wonder, but to acknowledge the silent legacy of hands like Hephaestus, bent, burned, uncelebrated, but always building. Reflection. Hephaestus reminds us that history is not only written by the victors. Sometimes it's shaped by the welders, the smiths, the quiet minds behind closed doors. This is not a tale of triumph. It's a tale of resilience. A divine example of enduring rejection, finding purpose, and pouring everything into work that outlives its maker. He may not have been loved, but he was never forgotten. Story 3. Demeter's Endless Winter. A weather report from 800 BCE, before climate science, before meteorology, before umbrellas, and forecasts and apps that tell you when it will drizzle. There were myths. And for the ancient Greeks, few stories explain nature better than that of Demeter and Persephone. A tale of graying, grief, and the first long winter. This story begins not in war or love, but in a field. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was a quiet force on Olympus. She didn't throw lightning or plot seductions. She tilled. She blessed. She grew. Every golden wheat stalk that danced in the breeze. Every olive tree. Every vineyard stretching toward the horizon. She watched over them all. But unlike other gods who cavorted freely on Olympus, Demeter spent much of her time on Earth, walking among farmers, favoring small villages, teaching mortals the rhythms of sowing and reaping. She was not glamorous, but she was essential. Crops bloomed under her gaze. Her daughter, Persephone, was her light. Some say she was born of Zeus. Others leave that part vague. But all versions agree. Persephone was radiant, youthful, gentle, and beloved beyond measure by her mother. They lived in a balance, mother and daughter, earth and bloom. It was not thunderous love. It was quiet, cyclical, rooted in the soil. But this is Greek mythology, and harmony does not last. One day, while Persephone wandered alone in a meadow, plucking wildflowers and weaving them into garlands, the earth beneath her feet cracked open. From the depths, a chariot surged upward, black, cold, gleaming. At its helm, Hades, god of the underworld. He did not speak. He simply reached, grasped her arm, and pulled her into the dark. The earth closed. The meadow was silent, and no one saw, except one. Hecate, the shadowy goddess of magic and thresholds, heard the echo of the chariot's wheels. And Helios, the sun god, saw everything from above, but chose, as he often did, to say nothing until asked. Demeter felt it instantly, a stillness in the air, a hollow where her daughter's presence had always warmed the earth. She searched the skies, questioned the trees, wandered through villages. No answer. The field sensed her sorrow. Wheat withered. Vines curled back into themselves. Animals refused to breed. Even the bees fell silent. Eventually, Demeter reached Helios, and only then did he confess. Hades had taken Persephone. With a nod from Zeus, the betrayal was quiet. But deep, Zeus had arranged the marriage in secret. Persephone, unknowing. Demeter, excluded. You see, even among gods, agreements were made behind closed clouds. And in this case, the god of the underworld had asked for a bride. Zeus, her father, had nodded his permission. And Demeter, the one who raised her, had been left out entirely. But Demeter did not rage like Hera. She did not hurl fire like Apollo. She withdrew. She sat down, and stopped blessing the earth. That single decision brought about the first famine. Crops died. The soil cracked. Villagers cried out in hunger. Even the offerings at temples ceased because there was no grain. To give, Demeter did not relent. She wandered in disguise, veiled and silent, refusing to return to Olympus. She came upon the city of Eleusis and sat near a well, watching the mortals bustle by, their baskets empty, their faces gaunt. One family, the household of King Celeus, welcomed her. Not as a goddess, they didn't recognize her, but as a quiet stranger in mourning. She stayed. She nursed their infant son. She tried briefly to start again. But grief, like harvest, is a cycle. And hers had no end. The gods on Olympus noticed. Not out of empathy, but panic. No crops meant no sacrifices. No wine, no meat, no praise. Mortals were starving, and their prayers had fallen to whispers. The balance between gods and humans was fraying. Zeus finally acted. He sent Hermes, fleet-footed and silver-tongued, down to Hades with a message: release Persephone. But things in the underworld are never simple. Persephone, by then, had grown quiet. Still, she had not aged. She had not wept, but she had eaten. Just a few seeds. Pomegranate red, bitter, sweet. This matters, because in the laws of the underworld, to eat its food is to belong. She had consumed 6 seeds, and with those, her fate was sealed partially. Compromise was made. One of mythology's oldest political bargains. Persephone would return to her mother, but only for part of the year. For the other part, she would reign beside Hades, queen of the underworld. Not prisoner, queen. 6 seeds, 6 months. And so the seasons began. When Persephone returned, Demeter rejoiced. The earth bloomed. Fields burst into gold. Trees shook off their frost. Spring came, followed by summer, full and ripe. But when Persephone left, Demeter mourned again. She turned inward. The world cooled. Leaves fell. the ground hardened. Winter arrived. Each year, the cycle repeated. And the world, at last, had weathered. It wasn't a thunderbolt, or a monster, or divine punishment. It was a mother's grief embedded into the soil. Unresolved thought. Was Persephone truly free? Or was she always divided between earth and underworld, mother and husband, light and shadow? And did Demeter ever forgive the gods? Or did she simply learn to live with loss, one seed at a time? Most myths favor clarity. Good versus evil. Victim versus victor. But the story of Demeter and Persephone resists this. It lives in the gray and shadow and soil, in months of plenty and months of grief. And in the center of it all stands Persephone, no longer just a daughter, not entirely a queen. After the great bargain, Persephone rose from the underworld for the first time, crossing the threshold between shadow and sun. Her feet touched grass. Again, the air was warm. Her mother ran to her with arms that had not held for months. The reunion, brief but overwhelming, stirred the sleeping world. But something had changed. Persephone did not laugh as she once did. She moved with grace, yes, but also with stillness, like someone who has seen too much silence. Demeter noticed. Mothers often do. Yet the world rejoiced. Fields turned green. Birds returned. Bees hummed again. The first spring was not just a season, it was a resurrection. But always, there was a clock ticking. A slow count of days until Persephone would return to her throne below. The underworld is often painted in horror. A place of torment and endless night. But in Greek thought, it was also structured, orderly, and permanent. There were regions for heroes, regions for the wicked, and rivers separating the living from the dead. And now, there was a queen. Persephone did not resist the underworld. She ruled it. And in that quiet transformation, from captive to monarch, her story took root. The Greeks did not see her only as a victim. She became Kore, the maiden above, and Despoina, the mistress, below. Her name, Persephone, likely means she who brings death, not out of malice, but out of inevitability. She walked between life and death, bloom and decay. Each spring, she returned. Each autumn, she descended. And in doing so, she taught humanity a pattern. Everything returns, and everything leaves, even joy, even harvest. Demeter, too, changed. She did not rage again. She did not bargain. She simply adapted. Each time her daughter returned, she poured herself into the land. Festivals bloomed across Greece in Persephone's honor, particularly in Eleusis, where the most sacred rites took place, the Eleusinian mysteries. These rituals were secretive. We know little of their exact rites, only that they involved symbolism of life, death, and rebirth. Initiates believed they received knowledge about the afterlife, that death was not an end, but a crossing. And at the heart of it all stood Persephone, not Hades. Not Zeus. P. or Saplne. The girl who was once stolen. The queen who returned by choice. It's worth pausing here. In a world ruled by male gods, Persephone's annual movement governed the world's entire agricultural cycle. That's power, quiet, rhythmic, often overlooked but absolute. There's something else. The seeds. Pomegranate seeds are small, juicy, red like blood. To eat them is to accept the underworld. But 6 seeds? Not a feast. Just enough. Did Persephone eat them willingly? Did she know the rules? Some versions say yes. That she chose to bind herself so that she could return. That she found, in the still halls of the dead, a space that was hers. Others insist it was a trick, that Hades lured her with sweetness, knowing what even a bite would cost. But maybe both are true. Maybe Persephone didn't want to be only one thing. Not only a daughter, not only a wife, not only alive. Maybe she chose both. In the modern world, we think of seasons as weather. But to the ancients, they were emotional truths. Spring wasn't just about flowers, it was about return. Winter wasn't just about cold, it was about absence. And this myth gave those shifts meaning. Each cycle, Persephone's descent reminded mortals that darkness returns. But so does growth. Grief, like frost, melts eventually. Demeter taught them how to sow. Persephone taught them how to wait. It's a feminine myth in many ways. Not in the modern gendered sense, but in tone. It is slow. It does not conquer. It endures. And while it lacks the glamour of Zeus' thunderbolts or the tragedy of doomed heroes, it lingers. Because every year, when the leaves fall and the air grows sharp, we are reminded someone has gone below. And every spring, when petals open and roots push up through thawed soil, we remember she's coming back. By now, you know the cycle. Persephone descends. Demeter mourns. The earth falls silent. Then Persephone returns. Her mother rejoices. And the world, again, begins to grow. But the story of Demeter and Persephone is not just an emotional metaphor. It shaped how ancient people lived, how they planted, how they harvested, how they marked time. It didn't merely explain the seasons. It structured them. The myth turned nature into narrative. And in a world before science, stories were survival. Let's return to Eleusis, the small city near Athens where Demeter, in her grief, once sat at a well. It became a holy site, a sanctuary. And for nearly 2,000 years longer than most religions, today the Eleusinian mysteries were held in her honor. Initiates from across the Greek world gathered in secret each year. The exact rites are lost to time, kept hidden even under threat of death, but we know the themes: descent, searching, reunion. The rituals involved fasting, drinking a sacred barley-based beverage, and reenacting Persephone's return. It wasn't about worshipping power. It was about honoring grief. In these rites, participants walked with Demeter. They mourned with her, waited with her. And then, when Persephone emerged from shadow into sunlight, they celebrated with her. It was not just a religious event. It was agricultural, psychological, cosmic. For farmers, the myth gave structure. You plant when Persephone is above. You reap when she smiles. You store grain as she departs. You pray during the cold months of her absence. But for individuals, it offered something deeper. It offered the idea that loss is not final, that even in the darkness of the underworld, there is the promise of return. This was radical in its time. Greek mythology is filled with irreversible fates. Cassandra doomed to be ignored, Sisyphus doomed to roll, Tantalus doomed to hunger. But in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, we find a rhythm, not a punishment, a pattern. And patterns can be lived with. It's also a myth about memory. Each seed Persephone ate was a memory, a tether to the underworld. And each moment on earth was colored by absence. She could never again live fully in one place. And neither could Demeter. They were bound not by death, but by seasons. And this idea spread. The Romans took it up. Demeter became Ceres, from which we get the word cereal. The same goddess who lost her daughter gave us the word for our breakfast. That is how deep this story runs. From divine sorrow to the supermarket aisle. You might also notice that no great battle took place in this myth. No monsters were slain. No cities fell. The conflict was intimate. A mother losing a daughter adjusting to a new life. A world adapting to both. And yet, its consequences were universal. What does it mean to mourn in a world that demands productivity? Demeter answered by stopping the crops. She taught the gods that grief has consequences, that the world does not turn simply because someone demands it. It grows when it is ready. Her withholding was not vengeance. It was grief made visible. And that, perhaps, is the myth's quiet power. In most religions, gods demand offerings. In this one, a goddess withdrew. Not to punish, but because she couldn't pretend. It's a reminder that even the divine can feel hollow, and that sometimes doing nothing is its own kind of power. Persephone, too, teaches a strange kind of strength. That she did not storm Olympus. She did not defy Hades. She accepted her role, but she shaped it. She brought spring with her. She ruled the dead not with terror, but with presence. She is the rare mythological figure who embraces duality, life and death, daughter and queen, light and dark. She does not resolve the contradiction. She lives it. In a modern world obsessed with resolution, the Persephone myth feels timeless because it doesn't fix things. It simply continues. And each time we cycle through seasons, each time we plant or grieve or walking an old path, one paved not in marble but in pomegranate seeds and barley and breath. Final reflection. Some myths roar. This one breathes. It's a story of seasons, but also of survival. It doesn't offer escape from pain. It offers a pattern to carry it. The meter. And Persephone remind us that what withers can bloom again. That absence is not erasure. That life, even at its most cyclical, holds meaning. And perhaps that is why, even now, when winter drapes the land in silence, we find comfort in waiting. Not for spring, but for her. Story 4. Hermes invents the lyre, stealing cows to make music. Some gods take millennia to shape their legacy. Others arrive ready. Hermes, the messenger god, didn't wait to grow up before making trouble. According to myth, he began his career in divine mischief within hours of his birth. Born in a cave on Mount Selene to the nymph Maia, one of Zeus' lesser-known romantic conquests, Hermes entered the world not with a cry, but with a grin. By sundown, on his first day, the newborn god had already escaped his cradle, invented an instrument, and stolen an entire herd of sacred cattle. Let's pause there. It's rare that a myth begins with a baby committing livestock theft. But such is the character of Hermes. He was not like Apollo, glowing and dignified, or Ares, aggressive and brooding. Hermes was something altogether different, a god of boundaries and crossings, of roads and thresholds, of trade, of lies, of language. And right from the beginning, he did not stay where he was put. He slipped from his mother's arms, crawled out of the cave, and made his way across the plains of Thessaly, where his half-brother Apollo kept a herd of sacred cattle. Now, stealing from a god is a bold move. Stealing from Apollo, the god of prophecy and law, is not just bold, it's brazen. But Hermes had a plan. Using cleverness far beyond his hours, he reversed the hooves of the cattle, forcing them to walk backwards. This meant that their tracks pointed in the wrong direction, leading any tracker away from their actual path. He also wore sandals made from branches to disguise his own footprints. And just like that, the baby god stole 50 of Apollo's finest cows. But Hermes didn't steal them for meat or vengeance. He had another idea entirely. After leading the cattle to a hidden place, he sacrificed 2 of them, not in hunger, but in honor of the gods. He cooked the meat, offered it in ritual fashion, and introduced himself to Olympus not just as a thief, but as a priest. This wasn't just mischief. It was a resume. Hermes then returned to his cave, crawling back into his swaddling cloth just in time to be found by Maia, who knew nothing of her child's side hustle. But Apollo wasn't fooled. When he discovered his herd missing, he did what gods do. He stormed. He questioned mortals, animals, even oracles. The trail was cold, the tracks deceptive. But eventually, suspicion led him to Mount Selene. There, he found Maia's cave, and the newborn Hermes lying peacefully, gurgling. And wrapped in innocence, Apollo was furious. He accused the baby outright, and Hermes responded with charm. He claimed he was too young to walk, let alone steal. He cooed. He smiled. He pretended not to know the word cow. It was the first recorded case of divine gaslighting, but Apollo would not be swayed. He dragged Hermes before Zeus for judgment. Now, Zeus, Hermes' father, watched this scene with amusement. He knew his son. He saw himself in the boy's cunning. And instead of punishment, he encouraged the resolution. So Hermes confessed. Kind of. He agreed to show Apollo where the cows were hidden. But first, he had something to offer. A peace offering, of sorts. He pulled from beneath his blanket a strange object, a shell, stretched with gut strings. A new invention, the lyre, crafted from the hollow shell of a tortoise and the entrails of the sacrificed cows. It produced a sound no god had heard before, gentle, golden, resonant. It was music. Real music. Apollo, god of harmony and order, was enchanted. The instrument soothed his anger, stirred his curiosity. In place of retribution, he asked to keep the lyre. And just like that, the first trade was made. Hermes, the trickster infant, handed over the lyre. Apollo, the radiant brother, handed over the cows. No punishment, just invention, negotiation. Charm. It was a defining moment for Hermes. Not just a prank, but a performance of identity. He became, in that one act, the god of trade, of music, of cleverness, of theft, and of invention. And more importantly, he taught Olympus a lesson it would never forget. Sometimes, it's not might or right that rules. Sometimes, it's the story you tell. Unresolved thought. Why did Zeus laugh instead of punish? And what does it say about Olympus that the gods could be persuaded not by justice, but by sound? After the cattle incident and the gift of the lyre, something shifted. Hermes was no longer just a mischievous child in a cave. He was recognized, not as an equal perhaps, but as a necessary part of Olympus. A god with a function, a place, a portfolio. And for the Olympians, that was saying something. The lyre, which Apollo accepted with surprising grace, became one of his most treasured symbols. He would later teach Orpheus to play it. Its strings would sing in myths and poetry for centuries. But its origin as the first divine bribe, strung together from stolen livestock and a tortoise, was rarely mentioned. That's how Hermes worked. He gave the gods what they didn't know they needed and made them forget where it came from. With the lyre transferred and the cattle returned, Zeus took interest in his youngest son. Not because of discipline, but because he saw something valuable. Hermes could move between worlds. Most gods, you see, had boundaries. Apollo remained among the arts and prophecies. Poseidon ruled the seas. Hades stayed below. But Hermes could go anywhere. His speed and cunning allowed him to slip between realms unnoticed. Olympus to Earth, Earth to Underworld. Conversation to silence. Zeus saw potential not in war, but in communication. And so, Hermes was granted his official role, messenger of the gods. But this was more than a postal title. Hermes became the god of transitions, of travelers, of language, and symbols. He was the divine intermediary, a diplomat, a smuggler, a deal maker. He could cross lines, others could not, and he didn't need force to do it. He needed only wit. His symbols reflect the shift he was given. Winged sandals, Talaria crafted by Hephaestus. These weren't just fashionable. They allowed him to move at the speed of thought. He wore a winged hat Pegasus to match, and he carried a staff, the caduceus. Two snakes, intertwined, climbing a rod. Now, there's confusion here. Many associate this symbol with medicine, mistaking it for the rod of Asclepius, which has only one snake. But Hermes' staff was never about healing. It was about negotiation. Snakes, long seen as symbols of wisdom and duality, coiled around the staff of the god who made opposites meet. Light and dark, mortal and divine, language and silence. Hermes didn't fight. He persuaded. He was not heroic in the conventional sense. He did not slay monsters. He didn't lead armies. But he helped others do so. And he always got there first. He delivered souls to the underworld, one of the few gods who could move between life and death. He led Perseus to Medusa. He whispered strategies to Odysseus. He handed messages to mortals and gods alike, and he never forgot his roots in mischief. Even as Olympus gave him new jobs, new robes, new titles, Hermes kept his sideways grin. He played games. He tricked mortals and gods for sport. But he rarely caused harm. His pranks were precision tools, always revealing something underneath. For example, his theft of Apollo's cattle wasn't just a prank. It exposed how much the gods cared about possession, about property, about image. Apollo, the perfect golden boy, was undone by the cleverness of a newborn. And rather than destroy the child, he traded with him. This was Hermes' magic. He made others see value in what they had dismissed. He turned a turtle shell into a lyre. He turned theft into worship. He turned himself, born in a cave and ignored by the court, into a god who could speak for all others. Even his mother, Maia, stayed hidden. She didn't push for status. She didn't sit at Zeus' side. But her son? He visited every god, every shrine, every temple. His voice was carried in prayers, in poetry, in travelers' footsteps, and still, he remained informal. Hermes didn't seek thrones. He preferred crossroads, market stalls, the liminal. He became the god of things not yet decided, of contracts not yet signed, of travelers not yet arrived. He was always moving, and that made him immortal in a way. The other gods were not, because no matter how great a god may be, someone has to deliver the message. And no matter how glorious a hero becomes, someone has to guide him home. That someone was Hermes. Unresolved thought. What kind of power lies in movement, not might? And does the one who speaks for the gods ever speak for himself? Story 4. Hermes invents the lyre. Stealing cows to make music by now, Hermes had been given a seat at Olympus' crowded table, not through inheritance or conquest, but through cleverness. His rise wasn't the kind sung about in epics. It was quiet, cumulative, a string of small deeds that, together, formed the framework of a god who could not be ignored. He was now god of roads, of merchants, of thieves, of dreams, of boundaries, and of transitions between states. But perhaps most significantly, he became Psychopompus, the soul guide. It's a role not many desired, carrying the spirits of the dead to the underworld, not judging them, not punishing, not weeping, just walking beside them, silently, kindly, swiftly. Imagined that for a moment. In a world where even the gods bicker and boast, Hermes is the one who meets you at the edge, offers no judgment, and simply escorts you to the other side. He speaks for no one in that moment. He just walks with you. He's the last presence you meet before crossing into death. There's power in that. A subtle, unadorned power, and it matches his life. Even his pranks had weight. He gave mortals writing, not just the alphabet, but the idea of symbols standing in for meaning. The invention of coinage was associated with him too. Portable value, agreed upon, negotiable. Commerce, after all, is trust turned tangible. And who better to oversee trust than the god who began his life with a lie? But Hermes was never malicious. He was not like Eris, who delighted in chaos, nor like Ares, who fed on blood. His mischief had purpose. He taught boundaries by crossing them. He revealed hypocrisy by exposing it. And most of all, he moved always forward, always between. This made him timeless, When the Roman world took him in, he became Mercury, god of trade, travel, and eloquence. The symbol for speed, for communication, for markets. He wasn't just kept, he was expanded. The swiftest god adapted perfectly, too. Empires and cities and economics, even in modern times. His image lingers. The caduceus appears in medicine, mistaken though it may be. His name is used in astronomy, chemistry, logistics. His qualities, speed, cleverness, adaptability, are seen as virtues in a global world. And yet, few worship Hermes now. Few remember the baby in the cave, the stolen cattle, the turtle shell. Fewer still recall that his most sacred act was not invention or commerce, but kindness at the end of life. He walked beside the dying. No gods fought him for that role. No glory came with it, but it endured, because it had to. And so Hermes remains in myth and memory as the god who always goes where others won't. He doesn't stay still. He doesn't demand temples. But he is always on the road between worlds, between deals, between states of being. And perhaps that is why he is one of the few gods who never seems to fall. He never grows stale. Because he is motion itself. Not the storm, but the wind. Not the fire, but the spark. Not the hero, but the guide. And the lyre? It stayed with Apollo. It sang in other myths. It became a symbol of harmony and beauty. But its origin, a stolen cow, a trick, a tortoise, remains Hermes' secret signature. A reminder that even the divine need a little chaos. And that music, like life, often begins with mischief. Final reflection. Hermes' story isn't about triumph. It's about movement. He shows us that power doesn't have to be loud. That transformation can be clever. And that sometimes, the ones who go unnoticed carry the heaviest messages. He never asked for worship, but he always showed up. Story 5. Athena versus Arachne. The first embroidery drama in ancient Greece. Gods were not just prayed to. They were feared, especially when it came to skill. You could sing, as long as you didn't sing better than Apollo. You could boast, as long as you remembered your place. And if you were a woman with a gift, you'd best keep your praise modest. Unless you were. Arschne. Her story begins not in a palace, but in a small town in Lydia where the sun was warm, the olives ripe, and the looms rarely silent. Arachne was a weaver, not divine, not noble, not even born of gods. Just a mortal girl, gifted with needle and thread. But her talent was unmatched. Her tapestries shimmered with color. They seemed to breathe. Fields of flowers looked like they moved in the breeze. Stories of gods and mortals danced in thread across linen. Birds, trees, ocean waves, she wove them all. Crowds gathered to see her work. And as they did, whispers turned to applause, and applause into declarations. Surely, they said, she was taught by Athena herself. And here lies the problem. For in Greek mythology, Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and craft, was also the divine patron of weaving. She represented the mind, logic, and skill. And in Arachne's art, the people saw divinity. But Arachne didn't shy away. She didn't bow her head or give thanks to the goddess. She said, plainly, I taught myself. And when challenged further, she said something worse. I could weave better than Athena. In the tapestry of Greek myth, such pride, hubris, was the thread that often unraveled a life. Still, the words were said, and Athena heard them. The goddess did not descend in her golden armor or on a chariot of thunder. Instead, she visited the girl disguised as an old woman. She warned her gently. You weave well, child, she said, but show humility. Give. Thanks to the goddess who gave you this gift. But Arachne, proud and firm, did not budge. I've seen what others call divine. My work is better. It was then that Athena shed her disguise. Light blazed. The old woman became a warrior maiden, clad in shimmering robes, her face both beautiful and terrifying. The crowd fell silent. Arachne froze, but only for a moment, and then she bowed her head, not in fear, but in respect, and spoke again. "If you wish, let us compete." This was no small thing, a mortal challenging a god, not with sword or shield, but with thread. And so the looms were set. Two women, side by side, one divine, one human. Their shovels clicked like soft drum beats. The fibers stretched tight with tension. The crowd gathered. Breathless, Athena began her work. Her tapestry depicted the gods in all their glory. Zeus on his throne, Poseidon with his trident, Apollo crowned in laurel, and in the corners, she wove warnings, scenes of mortals who challenged gods and paid the price. Niobe weeping for her children, Marsyas flayed for his music. It was art with a message. Beware arrogance. And Arachne? She wove something else entirely. She wove truth. Her tapestry showed the gods not in glory, but in shame. Zeus deceiving women in disguise. Poseidon chasing nymphs. Dionysus luring mortals into madness. Her skill was breathtaking. Her threads glowed with color, and every seam was woven without fault. But her subject was bold. Too bold, because she did not lie. She did not flatter. She simply showed the gods as they were. The crowd could barely look. And Athena? She stood, eyes fixed on the tapestry. She did not find a flaw. She could not deny the craft. The mortal girl had woven perfection. And that was the deepest insult of all. Because Arachne had not just challenged a goddess. She had won. Unresolved thought. What should a god do when shown their own flaws perfectly woven into art? Can divinity forgive accuracy? Arachne's tapestry hung in the sunlight like a window into uncomfortable truths. Thread by thread, she had documented the misdeeds of the gods, their vanity, their deception, their appetites. No exaggeration, no blasphemy, just skillful, detailed storytelling woven with honesty, so precise it left no room for denial. And that was the problem. Athena, goddess of wisdom and craft, stood before it. Her own tapestry, magnificent and measured, upheld the glories of Olympus and the dangers of pride. But Arachne's work was more daring. More dangerous. It told the truth. No mortal should have been able to weave like that. No mortal should have had the audacity to. And no god, least of all Athena, the embodiment of discipline and intellect, could allow it to go unpunished. The silence between them stretched long. Then came the judgment. Athena didn't argue. She didn't praise. She didn't even raise her voice. She tore Arachne's tapestry from the loom. She ripped it to threads. She turned to the girl and struck her, not with a weapon, but with shame, divine humiliation. Her eyes, once sharp with challenge, now swam with understanding. This wasn't a competition. It was a trial, and she had passed it too well. Arachne didn't cry. She didn't run. Instead, she found a length of rope. Prepared to end her life. It was not pride anymore. It was sorrow. But Athena, watching, intervened. Not with mercy. Not with forgiveness. With transformation. She touched the girl's shoulder and whispered a sentence. A curse. A gift. A sentence without end. "You will never die," the goddess said, "but you will hang forever and weave forever." And so, the girl became a spider. Her body shrank. Her limbs stretched into delicate legs. Her hands, once so precise, became spinnerets. Her loom became her web. Arachne, the mortal who bested a goddess in craft, became the first spider. Her descendants would spin silk not from thread, but from the body. They would weave patterns on wind-stirred corners and hang upside down in doorways and rafters. They would be both feared and forgotten. In time, people would kill them on sight. But some, when watching the fragile beauty of a web glinting in morning light, would remember the story, the girl, the thread, the truth, and they would say, Arachnid, named. For her, there's a bitterness to the myth, a quiet injustice. Arachne was not punished for lying or for harming. She was punished for precision, for presenting the gods not as they wished to be seen, but as they were. Athena, for all her wisdom, could not accept the reflection. Still, it's important to understand this was not mere cruelty. It was a divine instinct to preserve order, to maintain Olympus as a place of respect, not of scrutiny. In that moment, Arachne became more than a girl. She became a symbol of what happens when truth is too finely woven. Unresolved thought. Is immortality a gift when it comes with silence? And can artistry survive when honesty is punished? Arachne never weaved with human hands again. Yet her work never stopped. As a spider, she spun without ceasing across the beams of temples, beneath the rafters of homes, in corners where no one looked but everyone eventually noticed. Her web was not warm like fabric, nor proud like tapestry. It was near invisible, delicate, temporary, but also unmatched. No thread on earth could rival it. Athena's curse was never reversed. Unlike other mortals punished by gods, Arachne received no reprieve, no second chance. She wasn't turned back into a girl. She wasn't rescued by pity. Her transformation endured, but it didn't erase her. Instead, it multiplied her. Across generations and continents, spiders spun their silken threads. They made geometry in silence. They caught not attention, but sustenance. And though they know, longer wove the tales of gods. Their work whispered of memory. And perhaps that was the greater legacy. Arachne's story traveled not just through webs, but through language. The word arachnid would one day classify an entire order of species named in scientific respect. Though rooted in mythological disgrace, biologists study her descendants. Poets remember her form. Artists still reference her challenged. And somewhere, in the architecture of myth, she remains. A girl who refused to humble herself, who dared to match a goddess, and who suffered not for failure, but for success. Athena, for her part, remains complicated in this tale. She wasn't cruel for cruelties. Saki. She is, after all, the goddess of wisdom and craft, of logic, of calculated decisions. But she was also a guardian of divine image, and Arachne's art revealed too much. Perhaps Athena feared that if mortals began weaving what they saw, rather than what they were told, the god's grip would loosen. And that fear led to silence. This isn't just a myth of punishment. It's a myth of editorial control. Art was permitted, but only if it flattered. And when it did not, it was torn down, and the artist transformed into something that could no longer speak. And yet, Arachne did speak. With webs, invisible until touched, fragile until tested, perfect until destroyed. There's something timeless in that image. The spider spinning tirelessly in the corner, unnoticed, misunderstood, sometimes feared, but always there, always creating. Arachne's transformation was not the end of her artistry. It was its evolution. And that, perhaps, is a quiet triumph. Because while temples crumbled and gods faded, the spider's thread endured. Even today, in laboratories and factories, we study spider silk stronger than steel by weight, flexible, resilient. Something born not of machines, but of body. A miracle of nature spun in silence. And is Arachne's legacy. Scientific and symbolic. She was not given statues. She was not given temples. But she was given a form that survives in the folds of the world. And that is perhaps the strangest form of victory. Not loud, not praised, but impossible to erase. Final reflection. Arachne's story is not just a warning. It's a question. What is the price of truth told beautifully? And when power destroys the tapestry, can the thread still find its way back into the world strand by strand, in corners no one expects? Story 6. The Labors of Heracles. What even was the Erymanthean boar? Heracles, also known by his Roman name, Hercules, is remembered as the strongest man who ever lived. Muscles, monsters, madness. His name still echoes through gym brands and action movies. But strip away the drama, and what remains is this: a man cleaning up after a bad decision. Born the son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, Heracles was a demigod from birth. Stronger, larger than the rest. But divine blood came with divine problems. Chief among them, Hera, the queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, had many grievances. But Heracles was personal. Not only had Zeus fathered him in yet another extramarital escapade, but he had the audacity to name the boy Heracles, meaning glory of Hera. As if naming a child after the woman you cheated on could ever make things better. Hera, unsurprisingly, did not accept the tribute. She made his life hell. She sent snakes to his crib. She stirred madness into his veins. And eventually, in a fit of god-induced delirium, Heracles killed his wife and children. Not in war, not in battle, in his own home, by his own hand. When the fog lifted, Heracles was broken, not in body, but in guilt. He needed penance, not forgiveness. And the oracle at Delphi gave it to him in the form of servitude, 10 labors. She said not to be given by Eurystheus, king of tyrants, a small man with a large crown. A man who, by blood, was Heracles. Inferior, but had been born first by a trick of Hera. A man Heracles could crush with one hand. And yet, Heracles obeyed him, because that was the point. The labors weren't about danger. They were about obedience. He would serve the man he could destroy. And so began one of the most mundane cycles in mythology. A demigod doing chores. Fetch this. Clean that. Kill this beast. Capture that one. Don't forget to document it. The early tasks were dramatic slaying the Nemean lion, whose skin could not be pierced by mortal weapons, beheading the multi-headed Hydra of Lerna, capturing the Ceryneian hind, sacred to Artemis. But by the fourth labor, things took a stranger turn. He was told to capture the Erymanthean boar. A boar, not a fire-breathing chimera, not a serpent with voices, a pig. Granted, a large, aggressive one, but still, a pig. And it wasn't even in a city or a palace. It was roaming the snowy slopes of Mount Erymanthos, tearing up farmland, terrifying peasants, and generally being a nuisance. This wasn't a task for a hero. This was pest control. But Heracles, still bound by guilt, accepted. He set off into the Arcadian mountains, alone. And that's where the myth becomes less about conquest and more about inconvenience, unresolved thought. What does it mean when a godlike hero is asked not to fight wars, but to clean up after them? And what, exactly, do you do when your punishment is to chase pigs through the snow? By the time Heracles arrived in the Erymanthean region, he was already known as a slayer of monsters. The kind of man who broke lions in half and laughed about it afterward. But there was little glory waiting on Mount Erymanthos. No crowds, no banners, just cold wind and a very angry pig. The Erymanthean boar wasn't mythical in the same sense as hydras or dragons. It didn't breathe fire or possess riddles, but it was massive, larger than a bull. Its tusks were thick as spears, its eyes hot with fury. It didn't fear men. It charged them, ripped up vineyards, uprooted trees, a living, breathing tantrum made of hooves and hide. And Heracles had to catch it alive. Not kill, catch, no swords, no smashing, no roars of triumph. This was not a fight. This was a trap, which meant the strongest man in Greece now had to learn patience. He set up camp on the slopes, watched the beasts. Patterns, where it rooted when it slept. Villagers whispered stories about its strength. One claimed it had torn a tree from the earth and flung it like a javelin. Another swore it had outrun a horse. But Heracles didn't listen to myths. He watched. He waited. He set snares that the boar trampled through without blinking. He dug pits that it skirted with ease. At one point, it chased him into a thicket, and he spent the night perched in a tree, soaked and grumbling. For all his power, he was still just a man chasing a pig through SNOWDRIFTS. Eventually, Heracles devised a plan. Drive the boar into deep snow. Slow it down. Let the weight of the mountain become his ally. And it worked. After days of slogging through mud, frost, and frustration, Heracles drove the beast uphill into drifts that swallowed its hooves. As it flailed and struggled, he leapt no blade. Just arms. He wrestled it into stillness, wrapped ropes around its legs, and slung it still snorting over his shoulders. Now, pause here. This is the same man who slayed the Hydra and deflected arrows with lion skin. And yet, this image of Heracles mud-caked, grunting, carrying a massive squealing pig down a mountain is one of the most enduring because it's ridiculous. And that, perhaps, is the point. The labors weren't just tests of strength. They were humiliations. Eurystheus, the petty king Heracles served, wanted submission, not glory. He hoped that each task would chip away at Heracles' pride. And when Heracles returned with the boar alive, wild-eyed, tied like a prize, the king panicked. In some versions of the myth, Eurystheus hid in a bronze jar out of fear. The sight of Heracles carrying the beast so effortlessly reminded him of how close power really was, and how fragile his authority. He declared that from now on, all tasks must be delivered outside the city gates. Heracles, a servant, was not to bring monsters too close to the palace. It's both comic and telling, because while the gods and kings of myth clung to dignity and order, Heracles embodied something more dangerous: strength without deference. He obeyed the tasks, but with a half-smile. He followed commands, but with towering strength. And that combination terrified those who gave him orders. Even the pigs couldn't stop him. But Heracles wasn't free yet. The boar was just one labor. One box ticked. One more insult endured in a long line of absurdities. And still, he carried on. Because guilt, once accepted, demands everything. Unresolved thought. Was Heracles being redeemed through these tasks, or simply punished again? And again, under the illusion of penance? And when power is bound by duty, how long can it remain harmless? Heracles returned from the mountain, the massive boar still alive, its snorts echoing through the hills like laughter at the whole absurdity. Of it all, the man who could crush stone had been reduced to beast control. A monster catcher, a glorified errand boy. And yet he didn't stop. Why? Because this wasn't just a list of tasks. It was a map of consequences. Heracles had killed innocents. Not in battle, not in fury, but in a madness not entirely his own. His crime, though influenced by divine interference, was real. And so was his grief. These labors weren't heroic. They were penitential. Each task a ritual act of penance. The Erymanthian boar was labor number 4 of 10, or 12, depending on the version. Because, of course, even Heracles' punishments were subject to bureaucratic recalculations. 2 of the labors were eventually disqualified, one because he accepted help, another because he received payment. Even gods have fine print. But the boar task stuck. It was completed alone, with strength and cunning, and in the exact manner requested. The animal alive, bound, and delivered. And while the king shrieked and ducked into hiding, the people began to notice something else about Heracles. not just his strength, but his endurance. His ability to be mocked, ordered, dismissed, and still carry on. There was no army behind him. No Olympus blessing his every move. Just one man, walking back and forth across Greece, solving other people's problems, slaying lions, cleaning stables, chasing pigs, and never asking for glory. In this sense, Heracles became less of a demigod and more of a metaphor. He represented every person burdened by a past they didn't fully control. Every person doing hard, repetitive, sometimes thankless labor in the hope of being whole again. The labors were not spectacular in their scope. They were deliberately inconvenient. That was the point. Heracles could not fight his way out of guilt. He had to work through it. Even the bore, ridiculous though it seemed, mattered. Because it was an act of containment, of control, of facing something wild and bringing it to submission without violence, a break from the usual bloodshed. And the irony? This might have been his most difficult challenge, not an effort, but an ego. To accept humiliation, to accept orders from a man he could squash, like a fig. To carry a squealing beast on his back while the world looked on. This wasn't divine retribution. It was human consequence. Later myths would elevate Heracles again. They would show him ascending to Olympus, being forgiven, even becoming a god. But here, midway through his labors, he was still something more relatable. A man doing what he could to make things right, knowing full well he never fully could. The Erymanthian boar, of all his tasks, is often overlooked. It lacks spectacle. It doesn't end in fire or glory. But it tells us more about Heracles than any dragon ever could. It tells us he kept going. Not because he had to, but because guilt leaves no other direction. Final reflection. We often remember Heracles for his strength, but perhaps his real power was persistence. To carry monsters when he could have killed kings. To endure mockery when he could have claimed thrones, and to keep moving, not because he was a hero, but because he was trying to become human. Again. Story 7. Icarus and the Patent Office. Why wax wings failed to take off long before the wings. Before the wax and sun and sea, there was a man who built ideas. Daedalus. In the mythology of ancient Greece, Daedalus is remembered for one thing above all, creating wings for himself and his son. But before that final flight, he was already a legend-less warrior, more engineer. He was the original inventor, the master craftsman, the man behind the curtain. While gods hurled lightning and mortals clashed in wars, Daedalus was in his workshop, designing. He created tools, sculptures, devices, objects that didn't just serve, but solved. Hinges, axles, statues so lifelike they seemed to breathe. His work didn't roar. It whispered. Quiet, elegant innovation. But in Greece, skill was not always safe. Talent drew envy, and Daedalus had much of it. He lived in Athens originally, and there, according to some accounts, his nephew Talos showed promise of matching his brilliance. One day, Daedalus saw the boy invent the saw, inspired by the jaw of a fishbone, and he felt fear, not of the saw. Of replacement, of being forgotten. So, in a fit of jealousy, he pushed the boy from the heights of the Acropolis. Athena, watching from above, took pity. She turned the boy into a bird mid-fall, some say a partridge, and saved his life. Daedalus, however, was not saved. Exiled from Athens, he fled to Crete. There, the story shifts. Crete, land of palaces, bulls and sea winds, was ruled by King Menas, a man of power and paranoia. He hired Daedalus for a task few could even imagine: build a prison that could hold a monster. The result? The labyrinth, a structure so cunningly designed that even its creator could barely navigate it. Twisting corridors, dead ends, echoing walls. It was not just a prison. It was a puzzle, and at its heart lived the Minotaur. But the labyrinth, for all its fame, is not the point here. What matters is what came after. Daedalus, like many inventors, became a liability. King Minos, having used his genius, locked him up. He and his son, Icarus, were confined to a tower above the sea. Not dungeons, not chains. Just silence, stone, and height. They were too valuable to kill. Too dangerous to release. So there they sat. Daedalus, the builder of unescapable things, now had to escape one himself. It's an old story. The mind that creates the trap becomes trapped. And so Daedalus began to think again. Not of doors or hinges, but of wings. Unresolved thought. Can the man who built the maze also build the exit? And what does freedom look like to someone who has only ever created for others? Imprisoned not by chains, but by height, Daedalus faced the kind of problem only inventors encounter. How to flee not across land, nor through tunnels, but through. Escape from Minos Island, Crete, was impossible by conventional means. The ports were watched. The king's ships patrolled the waves. The labyrinth maker himself was a prisoner of reputation, a man too useful to kill, too clever to trust. So he looked to the birds. For days, perhaps weeks, Daedalus observed the gulls that soared above the Cretan cliffs. Their arcs, their glides, their flutters and drops. He studied the structure of wings, how feathers layered, how wind caught under bone. And slowly, in that lonely tower, he built. Feathers, scavenged from nests and courtyards. Wax, stolen from. Candles or scraped from offerings. A frame made of reeds and lightweight wood, curved to mimic the form of avian limbs. He constructed 2 pairs of wings, one for himself, one for his son, Icarus. Now, Icarus. He was not famous for wisdom. His name survives not because of what he did, but what he ignored. He was a boy young, restless, trapped in a tower with a father who saw the world as a series of equations. It's likely he didn't understand the gravity of what they were doing. And how could he? They weren't birds. They weren't gods. They were a man and a boy, strapping on wings made from kitchen scraps and coastline refuse, preparing to leap from stone into sky. Daedalus, careful as ever, gave a warning. Fly the middle path, he said. Too high, and the sun will melt the wax. Too low, and the sea's spray will weigh down the feathers. He wasn't being poetic. He was being practical. He had measured the wax, watched how it softened in heat, calculated the drag of moisture on feathered forms. Daedalus had created. Wings not magic. And they had limits, but warnings are quiet things, and youth is louder. When the wind was right, they launched. Daedalus steady, cautious, gliding over the waves like a silent ship. And Icarus? He soared. At first, his laughter echoed over the sea. He tilted and twisted, climbing higher with each beat. He wasn't flying, he was escaping. Not just from the island, but from the shadow of his father's brilliance. He forgot the weight of wax, forgot the brittleness of invention, forgot the warning, and the sun patient, distant, impartial, did what it always does. It shone. The wax softened, the feathers loosened, and then, the fall. There is no record of screams, just the splash, just the absence. Daedalus turned mid-glide, calling for his son, but the boy was gone. The wings had worked, and then they hadn't. Unresolved thought. Was it ambition that brought Icarus down? Or was it joy? And when an invention works too well, is the flaw in the design or in the user? Daedalus landed alone, somewhere along the southern shores of the Aegean, his wings still intact, his heart irreparably altered. The brilliance that lifted him from captivity could not prevent what came next. He found no body, only feathers, floating on waves, wax bobbing like driftwood, and that was the end of Icarus. There was no funeral. No monument. just an island later. Called Icaria, named not in honor of a boy's greatness, but his loss. A reminder etched not in bronze, but in map ink. A caution more than a commemoration. Daedalus moved on. He traveled to Sicily, found refuge in the court of King Cocalus, and built again. Some say he constructed new machines, irrigation systems, even temples, but nothing is ever mentioned about wings. Again, not once. The inventor who made flight possible never returned to the sky. He had solved the problem of escape, but not the problem of outcome. The wings worked, just long enough to prove fatal. They were a success, technically, but a tragedy in every other way. This is where the myth becomes more than a story, because Icarus doesn't die as a villain or a hero. He dies as a reminder that the line between innovation and overreach is thinner than wax in summer sun. We love the image of Icarus flying too high. It's romantic, bold, rebellious, but we rarely ask why he didn't just follow the instructions. Was he arrogant? Was he thrilled? Was he simply caught in a moment of wonder, forgetting that wonder often comes with weight? And Daedalus? His grief is not written in epic lines. It is implied. An absence in the records. A silence in the sky. He is one of the few figures in myth who is punished not by gods, but by his own creation. His tragedy is not hubris. It is precision. He got everything right, except the part where someone else uses what he built. The myth of Icarus is often told as a warning against pride, but that feels shallow. Because what if Icarus didn't fall because he wanted to defy the gods? What if he fell because no one taught him how to live with freedom? He had always been in a tower. Then, suddenly, the sky. Too much air. Too much choice. No railings. No ceilings. Only height. And height, unaccompanied by humility, can feel like invincibility. That's not arrogance. That's an experience. And so he soared. And so he fell. Daedalus kept building, but quieter. We're told he eventually outwitted King Minos, who tracked him to Sicily. He built traps, tunnels, steam-heated baths that turned deadly. Even after everything, he remained clever. But something changed. There were no more flying machines, no more reaching toward the impossible. Just mechanisms, solutions, controlled. Variables. As if he had learned that escape is not the same as liberation. And invention is not the same as wisdom. Final reflection. Daedalus shows us that genius does not shield us from grief. That even perfect design can carry hidden consequences. That the line between freedom and danger often runs through the sky. And Icarus? He reminds us that the thrill of rising is real, but so is the sea. Story 8. Sisyphus. Uphill battle. A case study in futility in the long, shadowed corridors of Greek myth. No figure is more persistently exhausted than Sisyphus. We remember him now as the man cursed to push a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to watch it roll down again each time he nears the top. A punishment without end. A symbol of futility. But that's not where his story begins. Sisyphus started not as a victim, but as a king. A very clever king. He ruled over Ephyra, what would later become Corinth, a thriving port city with a sharp mind behind its walls. Sisyphus was not strong nor divine. He had no heroic lineage, but he had something rarer, strategy. He was in a word, cunning. His enemies feared him not because of brute force, but because he could outthink them, outsmart them, outserve them. And like many clever rulers, he often found himself on the wrong side of the gods. One of his earliest offenses? He tattled. Zeus, king of Olympus, had taken a fancy to the river god Asopus' daughter, Aegina. He did what gods in Greek myth often did, abducted her, hid her away, assumed no one would know. But Sisyphus knew, and when Asopus came searching, Sisyphus struck a deal. "I'll tell you where your daughter is," he said, "if you'll give my city a spring of fresh water." The river god agreed. And just like that, Sisyphus made Corinth bloom. But he also made an enemy of Zeus. The king of gods did not take betrayal lightly, especially not from a mortal. But Zeus didn't hurl thunder immediately. He was patient. Sisyphus, meanwhile, continued with his tricks. Some say he founded Corinth's walls with deceptive treaties and backroom deals. Others claim he manipulated oracles. But all agree he was never content to follow fate. So, eventually, Zeus ordered Thanatos' death himself to claim Sisyphus. And this is where the story takes its strange turn, because Sisyphus didn't just accept his fate. He tricked Death. Some say he welcomed Thanatos warmly, offered him wine, and in that pause, slipped chains around his wrists. Others say he asked for a demonstration. "Show me how your chains work," and then locked Thanatos in his own device. Either way, the result was the same. Death was captured, and no one died. Not warriors in battle, not elders in their sleep, not animals, not even plants. The world held its breath. Life became crowded with the living. Even Hades, god of the underworld, noticed the silence. Something was wrong. Death wasn't coming. Eventually, the gods intervened. Ares, god of war, frustrated that his battles no longer had meaning, stormed into the mortal world, freed Thanatos, and delivered Sisyphus to the afterlife himself. But even in death, Sisyphus had a plan. Before dying, he told his wife not to bury him. No coins on the eyes. No rites, no farewells. He used her as part of the trick. Then, in the underworld, he feigned outrage. "I've not been buried," he cried. "No funeral. No coins for the ferryman. Let me return and scold my wife." Hades, surprisingly moved or perhaps just tired, agreed. And Sisyphus returned to life, to breath. And this time, he stayed. He resumed his throne, laughed at the gods, and lived for years. Until at last, the gods returned for him. And this time, they brought no loopholes, only judgment, unresolved thought. How many chances can cleverness buy? And when a man tricks death twice, is he clever or simply delaying the inevitable? By the time the gods caught Sisyphus for the final time, Olympus had had enough. He had broken too many rules, and worse, he had made the gods look foolish. In a mythological world built on hierarchy, that was the unforgivable crime. That it wasn't just that Sisyphus delayed death, it was that he did so with style, with sarcasm, with strategy, And so, Hades did not merely take him back to the underworld. He handed him a sentence that mirrored the nature of his offenses. Not fire, not chains, not torment in the traditional sense. Just a hill and a boulder. Sisyphus was led to the foot of a massive slope in the gray gloom of the afterlife. The air was still. There was no sound save for the shifting of the stone. He was told, "Push." And so he did. Hands against cold granite, feet slipping on ash, shoulders straining with immortal effort. He pushed the boulder upward. Slowly. Relentlessly. With all the force of a man who had once tricked death itself. Each time he neared the top, the stone grew heavier. Not by weight, but by will. It resisted. It paused. And then it slipped. Back. Down. Rolling, thundering, undoing every step. And so he walked back down. And began again. No instructions. No end. Just repetition. This was not punishment in the sense of pain. There were no lashes, no screams, no monsters. It was something far subtler. It was the endlessness of effort. A task with no completion. And for a man like Sisyphus, who thrived on schemes, on trickery, on endings he could control it, was the perfect prison. He had once manipulated death. Now he had nothing to manipulate but a stone. But here's the strange part. The myth doesn't say he wept or begged or screamed. He simply did it over and over. And that is where the story shifts from punishment to philosophy. Centuries later, thinkers and writers would look at Sisyphus not with pity but with awe. Albert Camus, in the 20th century, famously declared, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," because in the repetition, in the sheer absurdity of the task, there was something strangely pure, something defiant. Sisyphus had outwitted the gods, and though he was now under their rule forever, they could no longer outwit him. They gave him a task to crush his spirit, and he refused. To be crushed, he climbed, he pushed. He endured, and in that endless loop, he became untouchable, not heroic, not tragic, just present. The boulder no longer punished him, it defined him. Unresolved thought. What happens when punishment becomes routine? And if the task never ends, can it still be called failure? Sisyphus is still climbing. There is no ending, no dramatic final act, no redemption or escape clause. Just the slope, the boulder, and the task that resets at the very edge of completion. But perhaps that's why the story endures. Because in every era, in every life, there is a version of Sisyphus. Someone doing something hard, over and over, without praise, without progress. A parent, a laborer, a caretaker, a writer, a teacher, a clerk, a commuter, a soul who shows up, not because it will all be worth it in the end, but because the act itself is what remains. The boulder, always, returns to the bottom, and still he climbs. This was the genius of his punishment. It wasn't bloody. It was boring. And for a man like Sisyphus, whose life had been a chessboard of deals and escapes, boredom was the real torture. But here's the thing. Boredom does not always break us. Sometimes it sharpens us. We imagine Sisyphus straining, sweating, muttering to himself in the silence of the underworld. But we can also imagine something else, him adjusting, finding rhythm, refinement, repetition becoming meditation. One hand placement better than the last. One angle of push more efficient than before. He becomes, in time, not just a man with a punishment, but a man with a practice, a ritual, a strange kind of purpose. Camus was not wrong to suggest that Sisyphus might be happy, because happiness, too, can be found in motion, not in arrival, not in the celebration at the summit, but in the climb itself. The story of Sisyphus asks us not just to reflect on futility, but to rethink it. What if the thing you're doing, though it never quite finishes, is still worth doing? What if effort, sustained, becomes identity? What if the goal was never the top of the hill, but the act of returning to it each time? Even in the underworld, that is a kind of freedom. Because the gods gave him a task, but not a script. They did not tell him how to feel. They did not control his mind, only his motion. And Sisyphus, who once defied death itself, took the only power he had left, how he approached the task, and made it his. The stone rolls, and he follows, not because he must, but because he does. Final reflection. Sisyphus teaches us that even in repetition, even in struggle, there can be presence. That effort, without audience, without end, can still be meaningful. Not every task needs to be finished. Some are simply lived.